But the title that I gave to this talk today is Taking Turns with the Earth. So I'm going to go to the taking turns model. The reciprocity model is, by and large, you could say, it's good when, or it helps when you're dealing with substitutable items, as it were. So when one person gives another person something that needs to be substituted because it exhausts itself in the giving, and so you need to give in response, but you need to give something else, as it were. You can't give the same thing, and that is actually the standard model among economists for thinking of reciprocity, and it's also a standard model when it comes to thinking sustainability. I think that taking turns can help us come up with a different model. Taking turns is when what you are, or it's more useful when what you are dealing with in terms of sharing isn't a substitutable thing, but is a holistic item where elements of it may exhaust themselves, but not it itself exhausts itself in the giving. So there are certain kinds of things that are obvious candidates for this. Language, for example. The way we share language is very different from the way that we share food. Food exhausts itself in the sharing, right? Because we eat it up. But language doesn't. Which is why you could say when you share language, it becomes more in the sharing, not less, right? But only on a certain conception. As the title of the talk indicates, where I want to go is to the holistic object I have in mind is the sharing of the environment, is taking turns with the earth. Now, why do we get to taking turns, briefly? Now, I've said that we have to think time as co-implying in the present, the past, and the future. Past and future generations as not just cut off from the present, but as implicated in the present. That is what natality and mortality were supposed to help us see, this co-implication. Now, why does taking turns recommend itself for thinking the co-implication of past and future in the present? Because, again, to go relatively quickly, because when you think such a co-implication, you have to think the present, so you still have to think the present, you have to think presence, but as intrinsically related to past and future. Now, so what you have to think is the uniqueness, the singularity, the irreplaceability of the now, of the present moment, but in such a way that that irreplaceability is related to its coming to be from and its passing away into, that is, being replaced by another now, the one it gives way to. And that's what taking turns can do, because the turning indicates this coming to be and already passing away. That's the turning nature of time. But the turn is that irreplaceability of the present. That's the idea. So that what you're trying to think together is, on the one hand, the uniqueness of each now, as it were, but on the other hand, the fact that, well, it's only in the process of coming to be from a past and already passing away into the future. So you do justice to some of the necessity of thinking the present, but not in such a way that you thereby cut it off from past and future. This is a way of thinking about time that I think is best developed in Heidegger's text on the Anaximander fragment and in in Derrida's Rogues, where taking turns is discussed explicitly as a model for thinking time. So the phrase taking turns is not to be found in Heidegger, but that's because German doesn't have I think that's because German doesn't have a good phrase for taking turns. We talked a little bit about Japanese in that respect, and I'd like to hear more about how you say taking turns. And what it implies. That's of relevance in this context. But it's not easy to say that in German. That's not to say that the notion of taking turns doesn't exist. Of course it does. I mean, every time you play a game of chess or some other board game, you need to be able to talk about taking turns, because it's basically what's required. But also, if you do some, and I've done this, if you do some research on where does the notion of taking turns show up, where is it discussed in academic literature, for example, there's next to nothing in the philosophical literature. There is a little bit in Aristotle and Plato on democracy, but it's sharing offices, not objects, and it's not about time for them. It's just a question of reconciling freedom and equality. There's one article on intergenerational justice where taking turns is discussed, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But other than that, there isn't much literature on it. But beyond philosophy, there is linguistic discussions of taking turns, because we take turns speaking. So in sociolinguistics and in eco-linguistics, the notion of taking turns is discussed because it seems central to the phenomenon of speech. And so there's some literature there. And that's also because that language, I think, has certain kinds of features that recommend taking turns. But that's somewhat different from what I want to talk about here. So then, if taking turns is a good model for thinking the co-implication of past and future in the present, then could we not develop taking turns in the direction of sharing among generations? Is my question. And the answer is, I think you can work it up and develop it in such a way that it is useful for those purposes. You must first go from time to applying it to identity. Identity, the identity of an agent, for example, consists then in taking turns over time with a past and a future self in order to come back to itself, but thereby already opening itself up to taking turns with another. So that is, for example, how Derrida in Rogues thinks the relationship of turn takers when it comes to democratic sharing of offices. So he reads together Aristotle on the katameros, that is on sharing offices by taking turns, with his model of time. That's how he opens Rogues and reads them together. So that's basically developed in that text. But then if you apply to generations, which is what Derrida does not do, then you get the sense that a generation exists only by taking turns with holistic objects with previous and future generations. Right? That is the kind of model you then get for thinking intergenerational relations. The model is no longer of sharing a resource by cutting it up, by taking it apart and giving this to one generation and this to another generation. The model now is one of generations taking turns with each other, which co-implies past and future generations in the generation that is taking its turn right now, right?